CO2 is plant food as much as minerals, nitrogen, and a host of other things are also plant food. So we'll look at how CO2 affects plants directly, what other things are important to plants, and then how CO2 affects plants indirectly. Directly speaking, CO2 causes an increase in biomass yields. This leads to reports saying things like the Earth is getting greener, which is true. The increase in CO2 caused by humans is greening the planet. So that means CO2 is good for crops, right? Well, not exactly. When we look at crops, the things we actually care about growing well, there's a little bit more nuance. When you put a crop plant in perfect conditions, then adjust the CO2 levels in that laboratory setup, you get improvements to the overall crop yield, though at a lower protein to carbohydrate ratio, making it overall less nutritious, while reducing CO2 levels below 200 ppm all but kills them, going to show how sensitive crops are to fluctuations in CO2 concentration. And then also note that you get diminishing returns when increasing CO2 levels past a certain point. Well, what do you expect to thrive under new global conditions? Is it your fig plant that you have to water at the precise time every day, or the grains and vegetables that we rely on? Or the fucking dandelion that found a speck of dirt in the sidewalk crack? Well, you guessed it. The greening on our planet is largely driven by weeds and other plants that we don't particularly care about. Remember, just because something works in a lab doesn't mean it works in real life. Handguns kill cancer cells in a petri dish. Moving on to what other things are plant food? There's too many things to name. Nutrients in the soil are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, along with many others. They're affected by day and night cycles, the amount of water, the temperature, and of course CO2, relative day and night temperatures, water in the air, water on their leaves. The list goes on and on and on. So the real question is, how does the direct effect of CO2 on plant growth actually affect crops as a whole? What's the net effect? And that's where we get into CO2 indirects. We call these indirects because the CO2 interacts with the plant in an indirect way. So not the direct creation of carbohydrates in the plant, but rather everything else around it. Basically, how does the climate change affect these crops? Obviously, the biggest problem you would expect is heat stress. Looking at it from a climate change perspective, broadly speaking, irrigated systems fare a lot better than rain-fed ones. And farms may be able to mitigate some of the effects of climate change by planting better foods that are better conditioned for the new climates that they find themselves in. With that said, though, overall crop yields have increased over the last few decades, driven largely by the utilization of irrigation, chemical fertilizers, and crop variety. But this has been attributed to technological growth and not CO2 levels. In fact, when you take CO2 levels into account, growth rates are estimated to be dampened by 4 to 6% due to that warming. This suggests that crops may already be operating past their optimal temperature. We know that food demand is continuously increasing, and it should be noted that some studies show that a 3% loss on the total calories attributable to a crop increases price by over 20%. Basically, if you have more people and less calories, you need to grow more food. That food is dampened by the climate change effects. Overall, we're not going to see a net decline in overall yields due to climate change. Rather, we'll see technology having to work harder to make up the difference, resulting in higher food prices, lower per calorie nutrients, and greater land use. This will exacerbate food insecurity in the most vulnerable and poor nations. Some places will fare better than others. Some studies suggest that particularly climate change vulnerable places, like certain areas in Australia, see reductions as high as 25% to their crop yields. Overall, the IPCC synthesizes many of these reports. There's only a couple of cases where crop yield productivity has been positively impacted by rising temperatures. For the overwhelming majority, it's negative. This is driven a lot by droughts, heat stress, poor adaptation. Here's just a small snippet from that report. The combined effects of heat and drought decrease global average yield sizes of maize, soybean, and wheat by 11.6%, 12.4%, and 9.2% respectively. In Europe, crop losses due to drought and heat have tripled over the last 5 decades, pointing to the importance of assessing multiple stresses. Globally, floods have increased in the past 50 years, causing direct damage to crops and indirect by reducing yields by delaying planting times, which cost 4.5 billion USD in the 2010 flood in Pakistan and 572 million USD in the 2015 flood in Myanmar. Again, 2 very vulnerable places in terms of food shortages. And there's so much more than just crops. This also affects pests and disease and weeds. Remember the greening of the planet? Well, you get more weeds in your crops, right? It also affects our meat. So when we say plant food, yeah, that's one small part of it. But there's a myriad of other concerns regarding this plant food. If you don't believe me, just look at the farmers' drought in 2021. This caused food production in Alberta to reduce by 43%. Or look at StatsCan Canada. Wheat harvests have decreased. Canola oil production falls despite higher harvested area. Corn production rises despite decrease in bushels per acre driven by an increase in harvested area. Right? We're having to expand our growing areas for less and less returns because of these climate issues. Now and again, you get positive stories like potatoes doing well or soybeans doing well. But are we getting the point yet? This only gets worse with climate change. More and more droughts, more and more top temperatures being peaked out for where these plants can adequately survive. CO2 is plant food in the same way that 200 milligrams of caffeine is great before my workout, but 2,000 milligrams of caffeine before my workout might fucking kill me. Overall, whatever benefits are gained in biomass from increasing CO2 levels, the negative consequences created by a warmer climate vastly overshadow them, as this means more land, more water on smaller and smaller arable land. And yes, we can fight those consequences with biotechnology, water desalination, mining and more fertilizers, but that all comes at a cost you should be able to approximately calculate. A cost you could price into your economic system, such that the negative consequences of CO2 emissions could be accounted for. We could then implement that system and reward people for producing less CO2. I don't know, maybe we call it something like a carbon tax. I wonder if that's ever been tried.